One of the biggest problems that people have nowadays is that they don't know how to discern truth and live in the truth, and they don't know how to make better decisions more quickly. And so we live in a society that is constantly gaslighting us into believing certain things about whatever here and whatever there. And if you don't live this way, then that's going to happen. And if you have to think this way, then well, then you're that way. And it's just, you have to get a this to do a that, and you have to do a that to get a this, and all this stuff, right? It's just a bunch of people that are talking about talking, really. And so I'm curious about the structure of reality. I'm curious about how to actually apply frameworks to navigate through the terrain in which we are operating in, because we live in an anti-truth world and it's very difficult to navigate through. And so I wanted to come up with a framework to really help identify this. And we're going to be going deep today. And so I want to start out with saying that if you've ever wondered about how to navigate through reality properly, this is going to be the video for you. And so I present to you the Regal timeline theory. Now, I want to make sure that we are on the same page before we even start. So I've had created these presuppositions to ensure that we are, again, going to be able to apply the psychological structure and spiritual application, provided these new ways of thinking about the world and the new frames of thought that are going to be stemming from this. So a lot of timeline content, quote unquote, and research talks about outcomes. But what I'm interested in is the psychological structure and the spiritual application. Okay, so the core presuppositions for this timeline theory, the Regal timeline theory, is based on these core presuppositions right here. Time is not a belief or a feeling. Time is measured through irreversible events and consequences. A timeline shifts only when something happens. Timeline definition, for those of you that may not know what a timeline is, a timeline is a coherent pattern of causes and effects. Because in order to be on a timeline, you can only have causes and effects. Okay. In timelessness, which is something that we'll talk more about in a minute, timelessness does not have causes and effects, but timefulness and timelines do. So what does the Regal timeline theory reject? Unverifiable forces. If you can't verify it, it's going to be difficult to even consider it to be true to some degree, right? In any way, really. But identity-based authority is the second one. Belief without consequence. Okay, this is why belief systems don't really work with the Regal timeline theory. Systems that cannot be tested through outcomes, those are also going to be rejected based off of this theory. The laws, so thinking about the laws, statutes, and commandments in regard to the Bible and in regard to life in of itself, laws are invariant constraints of time. Statutes are applied rules for operating within those systems. Commandments, individual behavioral requirements for alignment. Okay. Sin, in this case, is collapse of timelines. So it's when a timeline is eventually going to collapse due to the behavior in it. Then salvation would then be the alignment of viable timelines oriented from places of timelessness. So notice how none of these are about morality. Okay, it's just about what is working without contradiction and how to reframe it from a psychological and spiritual perspective. I've been wanting to revolutionize psychology and spirituality for some time now. I've always felt called to do so. And I've always thought that it's going to be done out there, right? What I'm realizing is that you can't really revolutionize psychology and spirituality out there. It will always have to start internally. And so that's why I'm doing this, is because I'm aiming to see what is working without contradiction, right? So the Regal timeline theory, laws are not enforced by authority. They're enforced by time itself. Now, bear with me for a second, because I know a lot of people will say, well, what about God, right? God enforces the laws. Well, bear with me for a second, because we're going somewhere with this. So law then without love collapses time inward. Think about it as a spiritual tyranny, whereas love without law collapses time outward. Okay, think about all the perversion that's happening in our day and age now, where we see constantly this perversion of thought and of being, and there is this collapse of time continually outside of ourselves, in which we're to the point now to where we can't really trust anybody as a whole, and it's just difficult to live in the reality that we do. It's just a fact. And women and men just don't work anymore, and it's because the time has collapsed outward. Okay, so there's a bunch of love, but it's a bunch of like serial monogamy, for example, right? So that's what is happening outward. And the main part of this syllabus that I want to highlight is that I do not want to pretend like we are where we started, or we know exactly where we are, if we don't really know that. If we can't truly verify this, why should we believe that this is actually where we are? Okay, I want to know where we really are in time and where we really are going in time. So this is a follow-up to the syllabus before we get into the actual content itself, because we have to define terms before we get into this stuff, because this is going to revolutionize your mind. Okay, it's going to renew your mind in a way you've never even knew that could exist, and yet it's going to make sense to you by the end of it. So Regal timeline theory suggests that there are 5 things that can be applied in everyday life with the timeline theory, right? Number 1 is energy management. Okay, if a timeline with certain people repeatedly makes you invest energy without producing any clarity, it's not a viable long-term timeline. It's just as simple as that. And number 2 is disciplined speech. Speech becomes an alignment calibration. Okay, remember, the Word was with God and God was the Word. Yeah. Okay, yeah, that's for sure. Okay, conviction over agreement helps you discern who just agrees with you because they like your energy, and who acts with true conviction and coherence in their life. Because a person who acts with true conviction is not going to be afraid to discuss things, and they're not going to just dismiss things for no reason, and they're not going to just write things off. They're actually going to listen if they are able to operate in a high value timeline, and we'll talk more about that here, but you'll see why. So number 4 is free agency. If an idea cannot change a behavior, and it can't be tested, and it can't be falsified, then it is by definition just a narrative. Narratives in themselves are timelines of their own accord. Okay? And number 5, your identity does not control reality. It just doesn't. This framework can help you control the trajectory of your reality, though. Okay? So what does value actually mean? Long-term yield per unit of energy being input or output, right? And a high-value timeline, therefore, and I use these terms loosely with the high-value timeline, low-value timeline, etc., because there's a lot of talk these days about high-value men or how high-value women or whatever. What I want to focus on is, again, the structure. So a high-value timeline compounds in clarity, capability, and coherence through time. A low value timeline diversifies energy needlessly. It distracts and it collapses optionality. So, therefore, high value timelines by definition are based off of loose identities, can revise self concepts without shame, and they don't need to be right, only effective. Low value timelines are where identity is tight and tightened, feels threatened by new frameworks such as the Regal timeline theory, and experiences ideas as personal attacks. Okay, I'm sure whether it's in politics or at your family table at Thanksgiving or Christmas, whatever the case is, I'm sure you've seen this before. And some of you probably feel as if this idea in of itself is a personal attack, but that's okay. We're going to go through it and we're going to work through it together. So before we get, again, like we're really setting the stage here, right? Nothing that you see in the Regal timeline theory today is going to be what I consider to be absolute truth or final truth. And it's not a belief system either. It's a framework to help you operate inside reality. It is important to not defend identity when it comes to the Regal timeline theory, because it's usually the timeline that's quote unquote right and you who is wrong. If your identity collapses in a timeline where, in fact, you can actually have a loose identity, you can actually reverse self-concept without shame, and you don't need to be right, just effective, but you're just so hell-bent on your identity that you are simply incapable of stepping outside of that timeline. Guess what? It's you who's wrong. It's not the timeline. It's not other people. It's you. Because again, if you are having an identity that is too tight and too rigid, it's not going to work. Experiencing ideas as personal attacks, it's not going to work. It's not a valuable timeline. It's just not. So just because when you misinterpret something, for example, or you lie, or you make excuses to yourself, you are actually prolonging a fake timeline or purposely slowing the happening of events in that timeline because you didn't want to have to move to the next part of the pattern in that timeline. You did not want to have to actually do something about your life. You didn't want to have to actually view something in a different way. You wanted to be right. You didn't want to be effective. That's the truth there. So now we get to the actual Regal timeline theory. And it always starts with God, of course. And if God is timelessness, and if God is omnipotent and omniscient, well, then he must be timeless. He's not in time fullness. If God is in timelessness, then God is not an orderer in the human sense. God would be a condition that allows lawfulness. He is grounding for constraints. He is the reason patterns are even patterns at all. And if God were inside time, God would be one actor wearing a costume among many. Timelessness is the reason all patterns exist at all. If God is timelessness, then God would have to be the why for how patterns can arrange themselves. Therefore, timelessness can't be demonstrated in linear terms. There we go. Now we already, this is where we get really crazy already, but not so crazy at all. It's actually very making sensing. So time is not linear. If God is timelessness and God can be anywhere and everywhere, then there are potentials of reality in which linear time does not have to exist. Right? Now we can experience time linearly, but it's not always going to happen simultaneously in linear terms. It was Kierkegaard who actually said that we can experience time forward, but we can only understand time as human beings looking back. And that's because we are operating in a three-dimensional world. Okay. However, we will talk more about geometry here in a bit, but the effect of the matter is that God is timelessness. I'm speaking on conditional statements of if then here, simply because it provides more of a logical sense of reasoning, and it allows people who may not fully understand or comprehend what I'm saying to do so. So again, going forward, God is timelessness, because that is by definition what he is. If he is omnipotent and omniscient, right? If so, then this. It's an assumption, but it's not an assumption. It's an assumption through logic, not an assumption just because we want it to be. So suppose then that there's an individual who exists, right? Suppose that there's an individual who exists whose name is, let's call him Joe. Joe exists, and there's an individual who exists whose name is, well, let's say Jesus Christ. How do we verify this? How do we verify that? Well, especially when it comes to Jesus Christ, we don't actually have, look, I follow Christ, but let's just be real here. There is no true verification process apart from the Gospels in which Jesus Christ was a real person. Now, you can say the Shroud of Turin. You could say that, well, what about all the manuscripts? What about the Gospel of Thomas and all this stuff? What about Constantine? You can talk about all these different people, right? All these different possibilities. But the fact of the matter is that we still can't really verify it. Well, so let's say then, let's assume this, right? We talked a little bit about narratives before. So you've seen movies, you've seen TV shows, you've read books, right? Apart from the Bible, perhaps, right? Well, if you've read these books of fiction, does the experience of reading them and experiencing the characters make them less real? Okay, like Iron Man, for example, or any of the Marvel characters. That's like a big obvious one, right? What about Lord of the Rings? Okay, Star Wars, whatever it is that floats your boat, right? Heck, even 50 Shades of Grey, right? Like Mr. Grey. I don't know, whatever. I don't know if that's a British whatever, but that's just what came to mind. So the point is that there are stories that exist, but how do we verify them? Well, we verify them through our own experience of them. We verify them through the teaching and the story within the teaching, and seeing that if we can apply them in our life empirically. That's how we verify it. So what I'm saying here is that Jesus Christ, even if he was not real as a person, quote unquote, right? If he was not a physical person, the story itself of Jesus Christ, I would say, is a literary masterpiece. It would be by definition a story that is a masterpiece. If Jesus Christ was not a physical person, because the teachings of Christ still apply. That is what truly matters here in the Regal timeline theory. So most people run on this time loop in linear time. Desire, story, action, excuse, delay. Desire, story, action, excuse, delay. They go on this over and over and over and over again. Over and over and over again, and they always delay their timeline. Right? Now, remember what we were talking about with the high value timeline and the low value timeline. They're always delaying their progress. They're just delaying their own progress. And so what you see then with nonlinear time within the Regal timeline theory is signal, story limiter, action, feedback, adjustment. Because now You have to live through this reality, whether you want to, like whether you want to or not. And I'm not suicidal, and I'm not encouraging people to be suicidal, because I don't think that's the right way to go about your life at all. But what I'm saying is that you're going to live, and it's a matter of how you adjust to the feedback that you get, provided your actions and in the story that you're telling yourself to create the signal. So we're working backwards right there, right? So we're working backwards there. But are we really working backwards? It starts with a signal, yes, but it goes beyond that. Okay, it goes beyond. And so start thinking in nonlinear time and see what happens. Stop trying to make excuses and delays for yourself, because you're literally putting on yourself on a low value timeline for no reason. A high value timeline looks like this, because you're adjusting based off of the feedback provided your actions and the story you tell yourself with the signal that you have. Okay. So there are 3 types of regal time in the regal timeline theory. And the regal timeline theory only accepts a type of time if it is, number 1, observable, number 2, distinguishable from the others, and number 3, verifiable through event sequences. So the regal timeline theory functions from frequency alignment rather than the linear cause and effect. Okay, let me read that again. The regal timeline theory functions from frequency alignment. Alignment is going to be very important in the keyword here, rather than linear cause and effect. So there are essentially 3 types of time. There are watch time, event time, and individual time. The 4th would be the universal time that encapsulates timelessness. But for the sake of the application process, I'm going to use only these 3 types of time. So, watch time, a mechanical coordination. This is clocks or calendars, etc. Whatever you need to, like the sun, right? Like watching the sun go up, the sun go down, the moon cycles, that kind of thing. Then there is event time. Now, actions and causal sequences are going to be what are in event time, because cause and effect, again, only exists on a timeline, not in timelessness. So event time is not linear. Remember what we just talked about here with the linear terms? Okay, event time is not linear. Watch time is going to be linear, simply because that's how we measure time in different ways. But is it the best way to measure time? I don't think so, and I'm going to talk more about that. But then we have event time, actions and causal sequences, right? But that doesn't mean that it's going to be linear. It's just a timeline. It can happen at any given time on the timeline. And then the individual time is an internal resolution, learning rate, or perception of change. Okay? So your individual time is not event time and watch time, but your individual time can exist through event time and watch time. So modern calendars are just one way to measure time. It is important to ask where the information and data points are coming from in any given timeline. Otherwise, you're going to get your data from the infrastructure of the matrix, so to speak, and you will simply be a construct of knowledge within the matrix. You might think you know everything about whatever it is, but in fact, you're just really knowledgeable based off of the manufactured information that you were given. So you're not even thinking for yourself. You're just regurgitating information. And that goes back to what I talked about earlier with the conviction over agreement, right? Are they acting with true conviction and coherence, or are they not? So the position of the sun is not going to be a consistently good way to measure time for soul growth because, again, your individual time is not going to be the same thing as the event time or the watch time, but it exists within those timelines and vice versa. So consider creating your own calendar based on what I call archetypal correspondences, called the individuation constellation. And I'm going to talk more about archetypal correspondences in a bit, but what I want you to focus on here is the individuation constellation. So what I've determined to be the individuation constellation is your watch time, your event time, and your individual time combined is the individuation constellation. It is specifically for you. Now, I'm not saying that you are your own cosmos, but what I'm saying is that the soul itself can be viewed as a singularity for all intents and purposes. There's not going to be anybody like you ever to walk the earth ever again. So now we get into cognitive functions. And this is going to be important because if you know the MBTI personality test, is it the most accurate personality test? I don't know. I don't think anybody can truly determine whether or not personality tests are going to be completely accurate. But what I want to focus on are the functions within this personality test, because there are really 8 types of cognitive functions. There's introverted intuition, introverted thinking, introverted feeling, introverted sensing, extroverted intuition, extroverted thinking, extroverted feeling, and extroverted sensing. So this is based off of the psychological types that Carl Jung had wrote about in his book. And he determined that there are 8 functions and ways in which people operate through and navigate through the world. Think about the Regal timeline theory as essentially a building up of, or a digging even deeper of, what Carl Jung and Freud and everybody else, like this is deeper and building off of what they've already done. And again, nothing in here is final, and I'm not saying that this is completely absolute truth. I'm just saying that this can be a framework for you to operate under. Okay, so introverted intuition, you can think about that as an internal view of your timeline compression. And then your introverted thinking is going to be a timeline coherence. So how coherent is the timeline within you, and how coherent is the timeline acting outside of you perceived within you. Introverted feeling is going to be the integrity of the timeline that you're in. Okay, so if you're not really developed in these things, you're not going to have the ability to determine whether or not a timeline is coherent, or whether or not a timeline has integrity, or whether or not you can compress the timeline or not. Well, and why would you want to compress the timeline? Well, so that you can make sense of it simply, right? You want to be able to simplify something. You want to be able to treat yourself. Sometimes you need to be able to simplify things to the point in which you can explain it to yourself as if you were a child. Right? Because that's a sign that you understand it. Introverted sensing, the timeline memory. So it's a recognition of what's happened and when in the event time, essentially. Extroverted thinking is timeline enforcement. So can this timeline be enforced through specific actions? That's how the extroverted thinking process works. Extroverted feeling, timeline synchronization. Okay, so is the outside synchronized with what you're feeling internally? That's a good way to think about it. And then extroverted sensing is the timeline entry point. So that is when you enter the timeline, you'll be able to know when you enter the new timeline. So now we get into the geometry aspects. Well, and why is it important to talk about geometry in this case? Well, because geometry is very important in regard to any type of philosophical or psychological event, because what we're doing with the Regal timeline theory is essentially physics inside the psychology. So it takes geometry to understand this. And what I determined to be geometry in the Regal timeline theory terms is archetypal structure of space-time. So we can consider geometry as a map of event time probability, so to speak. And in Regal timeline theory, everything is events, patterns, and alignments. Geometry is a sound mathematical language for describing alignments in space, which this naturally extends into timelines. So geometry does not rely on human observation to exist, right? It's objective. It just is. It just is. Like pi wasn't a discovery. Like pi was not a discovery. Pi was just, or excuse me, pi was not an invention. Pi was a discovery. It's much like Bitcoin. Bitcoin, financially speaking, was a geometric archetypal structure of space-time. It's not like an invention. It's an actual archetypal structure of space-time in financial terms. So anything that is objective, therefore, there are the things that exist in time that do not rely on human observation. Okay, think about that for a second, because if there are things that exist in time that do not rely on human observation, do they exist? Well, yeah, of course they do, right? Well, but who is there to verify? Who is it that's verifying then? That's a question to ask yourself. Because something that I've thought about with the geometry archetypal structure of space-time is, for example, this is the golden ratio right here. This image is the golden ratio. And what I genuinely think is that it is the 2D version of how 4D time works, because 4D is timelessness, right? Like time would be a place in the fourth dimension. And so what I see is there's a really interesting way to view this, right? So if you are, let's say, you want to go from point A to point C here on this piece of paper, right? Well, in the second dimension or the third dimension, you would just have to travel across here, right? You'd have to go across the piece of paper to get to point C. But with the fourth dimension, what you do is the fourth dimension can just pop right through and allows you, it's like a wormhole, but with time. So what I think that the golden ratio is doing here is that it is a two-dimensional representation of the way time works in the fourth dimension. But we can only perceive it in the third dimension because obviously we're three-dimensional beings. So this is where we get into kind of deeper territory. Not that, like, if people are like, wait, we're getting deeper now? Yeah, this is where it starts to get deep. This was child's play up until here. So synchronicities, if anybody does not know what a synchronicity is, you can think about it as a meaningful coincidence. Okay, that's kind of what Carl Jung describes as a synchronicity. But in regard to the Regal timeline theory, I've determined it to be called a pattern convergence signal. I still think that the term synchronicity can apply, but for me personally, because I'm trying to create my own structure that is applicable and that makes more sense to me, I'm going to use the term pattern convergent signal. Okay. So synchronicity in the Regal timeline theory is a meaningful coincidence that appears as an acausal event in your timeline that resonates with another event outside of the immediate cause and effect chain in the timeline that you're in. So what could these synchronicities or pattern convergent signals mean? Well, they could mean that it's echoes of unresolved past events or patterns your present timeline needs to address, or even pre event confirmations. Okay, maybe you have a dream uh, about something and then it happens, right? That's pre-event confirmations. Warnings or accelerators for potential outcomes. Okay, think about that as well, because again, nothing is truly set with the Regal timeline theory. Destiny is something that you can choose. It's not really something predestined. There's going to be a pattern, perhaps, but you don't have to adhere to that pattern in that timeline. You can change the pattern. So consider these as symbolic messages from the past and or future happening in the present moment. So these synchronicities and pattern convergence signals happen when an event time from other timelines, quote unquote, overlap into yours. Individual time is perceived as the event in the event time as meaningful, or the watch time provides a time signature, so to speak, for the event in individual time and event time. So you can think about it as high frequency or high value timelines producing more synchronicities because possibility for alignment in all three types of time is higher. And then the low frequency or the low value timeline rarely send them because possibility for alignment in all three types of time is lower. Okay. So for example, recently I had an image come into my mind as I was talking to somebody about this. So we were talking about how to reestablish tools to claim authorship in ourselves. And I was thinking about belief systems and such, and I was thinking about belief systems in the sense that it's going to destroy me. Belief systems will destroy me if I have belief systems, because it's a timeline that consumes itself, or it's just a timeline that is fake and fabricated. And when I was thinking about this, I saw my inner child to be like a Superman, like an inner Superman. And he was surrounded by kryptonite, and there was these shadows all around. And I was wondering, what exactly did that mean? And how did that, like, what was the symbolism there, right, with regard to it? Well, it's like you can't really be Superman, and you can't really go to your full strength and mature when you're in belief systems. You just can't. It's just not possible. And so then today, like literally today, like earlier today at the gym, I saw a young boy holding his mom's hand, and he was staring at me like I was the most interesting thing in the world. And he's staring at me, and he's wearing a Superman costume. And so that's just a synchronicity, right? It doesn't seem like much, but for you, it's like whoa, that's a meaningful coincidence, right? That's a meaningful coincidence. And he was walking out the door with his mom on the way out. It was very interesting. So that's a pattern convergence signal right there. Okay. Creativity does not exist in the timeline theory. In the Regal timeline theory, creativity is not what you think it is. It does exist, but it's not what you think it is. It's a symbolic differentiation process. So it is the channeling of instinct and intuition, which in the Regal timeline theory can be a way that the future communicates with the past or the present. Because obviously, if it's happening in the future, anything that's communicating with the future to the past is obviously going to be or like in the past, right? So it's going to be in the past. It cannot be forced. Symbolic differentiation and the process therein cannot be forced, and it is simply a recognition of patterns in patterns. Okay, have you ever heard the saying of like, well, if I didn't come up with it, and if you didn't come up with it, somebody's going to come up with it. That's because you're channeling the pattern of timelessness through time using symbolic differentiation. So I suggest then that instead of the word creativity, given the Regal timeline theory, a better term might be symbolic differentiation. It is the process in which unconscious material becomes meaningfully separated into conscious material. Therefore, creativity is actually just an individual putting forth an expression of symbolic differentiation into the timeline. So you've also heard the saying from V for Vendetta. It's politicians and religious people use the truth to tell lies. Or wait a second, how did it go? What's the exact quote? It goes something like, oh yeah, artists use the truth to tell lies, whereas politicians and religious people use lies to convey a truth. No, that's not right. Crap. I can't remember the exact quote it is. But the point is that artists, oh yeah. Okay. There we go. Artists use lies to tell the truth. Whereas, because they're seeing the symbols, right? The symbols don't actually mean anything until they're put together in the differentiation process, right? But the governments, the politicians, the religious people, they're going to use the truth. They're going to use this truth in the story to tell lies. That's what it is. That's what I wanted to convey. So let's move on. Oh boy. This is where we get into deeper things. And we'll just jump in. So astrology in the Regal timeline theory. What I would call astrology then is a symbolic probability conjunction. Astrology is correlational and not acausal, not causal. Cause and effect can only happen, but only happen if there's no probability. But astrology is based on probability. Okay, so it doesn't have to. The cause and effect could happen, but it doesn't have to with astrology. This is one of the reasons why women nowadays and witches and all that, they're so into astrology, because they know that there's something truthful to it. They just express it in a way that's kind of bizarre. And they take it to be like, they worship this in the way that some people worship Muhammad or Christ and whatnot. Like they just, Shiva, they make an idol out of it instead of actually seeing the deeper meaning behind it. They're just making it an idol. So astrology reveals the symbolic logic of time through the event timeline and moves into individual time and watch time. Okay, remember the three types of time? There's individual time, watch time, and event time. So astrology reveals the symbols within the event timeline. Planets and stars don't determine your destiny, but they are symbolic probability identifiers. There will never be anyone born on the event time, individual time, and watch time that you were born on ever. Think about that for a second. Okay, when you were born, at the time you were born, nobody's ever going to be born in that time and space ever again on your individual time. So you are, by definition, looking at astrology. Yeah, the destiny kind of is written in the stars, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. So when I say symbolic probability conjunction, then what I'm saying is symbolic as a use of archetypes, signs, and the planets as labels. The probability represents the likelihood of the pattern reoccurrence, and it's not a certainty. Okay, it's not a certainty. And the conjunction then is an overlap of multiple timelines. Conjunction is an overlap of multiple timelines. So, for example, with astrology, you guys probably have heard, if you're into this stuff, you've probably heard that there's every 27 years is the Saturn return. And this is a theory that one of the reasons that there's so many people and celebrities specifically in the 27 club is because, well, that's their Saturn return. Okay, their Saturn return. And Saturn returns are supposed to be very significant for everybody. And it's every 27 years. So at the time of your birth, okay, where your Saturn return comes into play, yeah, there's going to be some kind of form of great significance. So when you're 27 and 54, and then, you can do the math after that. But the point is that there are certain things in time that are going to demonstrate the probability of your symbolic patterns given astrology. So now we get into numerology. Numerology then is a symbolic quantification message. Okay, anybody ever play music before? Okay, with music, there's 4/4 time, 12/8 time, 12/4 time, etc. Numerology is essentially a message from the tempo in your own timeline. That's a good way to think about it. And so it's not that angel numbers aren't really angel numbers per se, but they aren't angel numbers in the way that you might think. Think about them as notes in a song of an event within the event time of your timeline. Okay, so there's a timeline and there are events going through, there's watch time going through, and there are the individual expression of the time through those other timelines, right? So event time, therefore, is the symphony of your life within your own individual time. If you want to call them angel numbers and think about them as symbolic quantifying messages through the collective consciousness or unconsciousness, then there's nothing really wrong with that. Numerology then becomes an interpretive tool to navigate your timeline into timelessness. How does that happen? It's through the recognition of alignment and optionality. Through the recognition of alignment and optionality. Remember, optionality is a high value timeline. Alignment is a high value timeline. It's for a reason. Okay. Some people might not be ready for this, but you know what? While I'm here, I've got to just say it how I see it. And this is it. So we've talked about geometry, astrology, numerology. Now we're getting into reincarnation. So Jesus Christ in the Bible says, I am the resurrection and the life. Well, does this mean that reincarnation is real? Well, don't think about reincarnation in the metaphysical term right now. Think about reincarnation in regard to the structure within the timeline theory. So in the Regal timeline theory, reincarnation is quote unquote real, but again, not in the way that you might think. This is what does not reincarnate right here. It's not you as a personality or ego. It's not your name. It's not your memories. What reincarnation is then, or can be, is better described as an archetypal correspondence. It is an acausal alignment in a pre-existing pattern, which does not imply identity, continuity, or causation. Okay? Archetypal correspondence. It is an acausal alignment in a pre-existing pattern which doesn't imply identity, continuity, or causation. An archetypal correspondence, or a reincarnation, therefore, is focused on determining the following. Number one, unresolved tendencies. You could hardly begin to live by the time you die. Most people hardly live by the time they die, and they don't even know it. It's really sad, but it's just the way that it is. So focus then, therefore, on unresolved tendencies, whatever timeline you're in. Think about focusing on unfinished learning loops, archetypal roles, trauma patterns, or wisdom patterns. That's going to be how you can identify an archetypal correspondence. Because think about this, right? If you've ever seen Avatar: The Last Airbender, the actual cartoon, right? Or anime, whatever you want to call it. The actual anime talks about how when Aang is going through his chakra systems, right? And he's going through his, I just thought about how chakras could be applied to the Regal timeline theory. I didn't even think about that until just now. But that's something, again, there's a reason why I'm going through this as much as I can, but there's so much information and it just reformats and restructures everything and the way that I think about everything and how I operate everything. So, but anyway, in the anime, Avatar: The Last Airbender, Aang is going through and, igniting his chakras. And when he gets to the heart, he lays out all of his grief. And then he's feeling all of this loss, right? And the guru tells him that he says, "You have indeed felt a great loss. But all that love has not been, wished away. It's been reborn in the form of new love." And then he sees Katara, right? He sees the waterbender. And that's his, his wife or whatever down the line, I assume, right? So it's not that anything really goes away. It's just reincarnated, or there's an archetypal correspondence that occurs after that. Okay, this is why when you're in narcissistic relationships and you see a pattern of narcissism in your relationships, it's likely because that's a reincarnation of the same types of events that you're not learning. It's an archetypal correspondence of the events that you're not learning. Okay, I'm using these forms of language to really drive home that there's a different way to look at this stuff and a different way to apply it to your life. So when Jesus says, "I'm the resurrection and the life," it could also mean that Jesus Christ himself is the light and the source of that light that flows through all of humanity and all of life in of itself. Now we get to manifestation, which I am calling probabilistic actualization. Probabilistic actualization is the process of embodying a type of archetypal correspondence, or a reincarnated form, within your individual timeline, guided by the consistent patterns of the world through event timelines and watch timelines. Therefore, because think about all the manifestation BS that you see online, it's a bunch of BS. They're like, wish it into existence. No, that's a belief system. What I'm talking about is a real structure of reality that you can actually apply. Hence the term actualization, because you're increasing the probability that something is going to be actualized. Manifestation, it's just an ism for all intents and purposes. It's not an actual process. So probabilistic actuality comes about through observing, number one, event timelines, sequences of real-world events that reveal archetypal patterns. Number two, watch timelines, observational tracking of people, opportunities, and pattern convergence signals, or synchronicities for those that don't recall. So here are some examples of new thought algorithms that you could put into your repertoire. And I don't even know if I want to call them thought algorithms anymore. These are just going to be, think about them as limitless statements. Maybe that's a better way to think about them. But here are four. For example, number one, I am not on timelines that lead to unnecessary pain. Number two, I am naturally on timelines that are profitable in every sense. Number three, if it does not compound in clarity, it's not a timeline for me. Number four, I choose timelines with clear and clean incentives. In fact, let's just read through those again. I am not on timelines that lead to unnecessary pain. I am naturally on timelines that are profitable in every sense. If it doesn't compound in clarity, it is not a timeline for me. And I choose timelines with clear and clean incentives. So now we're going to get into what the Regal timeline theory can debunk, potentially. Again, because this is just a theory, but I'm very confident that it can be applied, and this is going to be what revolutionizes psychology and spirituality. It already has for me. Literally every single day is a mind-blowing event ever since I started thinking about this. It's just been crazy. So firstly, then, we can conclude that any revelation is event-based in event time. Okay? Think about that. Why? Because, well, prophecy, for example, that's just either God himself or the future you telling you a potential timeline from the future. That's what that is. So revelations are in themselves event-based. It's a happening. And it's in the event time, which means it's non-linear, right? It means it's non-linear. It's not a linear event. It's a non-linear event. So it is not static, which means that the truth will only appear when alignment exists. So this, however, means that truth can be real, necessary, revolutionary, and potentially dangerous all at once. So then, what does the Regal timeline theory debunk, potentially speaking? Well, number one, scripture, any scripture, as a literal timeline artifact. Literalism is fake. Again, I even view the Bible itself to be a literary masterpiece, right? I view the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita, the Egyptian Book of the Dead. These are all just literary masterpieces. I don't see them as literal anymore. I think it's best to just simply take the teachings from them. I think taking it too literally will lead you down a dark path. It'll lead you down a path of belief systems, which, as we've talked about throughout the entire video today, belief systems will destroy you. They will destroy your inner child. They will destroy your creativity. They will destroy your curiosity, etc. So the timeline theory then reframes scripture to be high-density symbolic snapshots. It is encoded for a specific archetypal moment or an archetypal correspondence, and written from inside a particular timeline domain. That's key as well. And why? Well, because the same text liberates some and traumatizes others. Depending on what timeline you're in, it's going to be seen a certain way. Pastors can quote truth and still destroy lives, right? And interpretation keeps fracturing. So religious dogma says if you don't read it this way, then you're wrong. But what the timeline theory says is if you read it outside its timeline, you're going to distort it, intentionally or unintentionally. Whoops. I meant to have that say number 2. Looks like I did that with the rest of them. But anyway, number 2. Salvation as a membership. Believe the right doctrine equals saved. That's a dogma, right? That's what the dogma of salvation is. That is false. That is false. Timeline theory then reframes salvation to be timeline stabilization, exiting timeline collapse trajectories, and entering sustainable futures and viable futures. This is why sinners can sometimes flourish. Righteous people, quote unquote, can be rotten from their souls internally. Conversion does not always change outcomes. And dogma cannot explain it, but the Regal timeline theory can. Okay, remember what we talked about at the very beginning of what salvation is? Salvation, the alignment of a viable timeline oriented from timelessness. And sin is the collapse of timelines. Man, somebody is pissed off at me for talking about this. I can feel the spiritual attacks and alignments. So, going back to salvation as a membership. Salvation is not a membership. Just because you believe something doesn't make it right. Okay, you have to have sustainable futures and exit timeline collapses. Because that's really what repentance of sin is. Repentance of sin is exiting timeline collapses. That's what repentance of sin is. What else could it be? Authority without alignment. High position does not mean truth teller. The Regal timeline theory exposes authority only functions when it reduces entropy. Titles without coherence collapses fast, and spiritual authority is felt, not enforced. People who want to enforce things have an agenda. Now, there's a difference between enforcing boundaries and enforcing truth, right? Because if you're enforcing a boundary, that's between you and that person, right? In the timeline. But when you're saying, no, this is truth and you have to believe it and you have to do it this way or else, says who? Says who? So this is why traditional pastors can feel threatened, or just religious spirits in general can feel threatened by your presence if you operate from your own individuation constellation. You remember what the individuation constellation is? Okay. If you are living from a watch time, event time, and individual time in your own timeline, that is an individuation constellation. So Bible reading around you becomes destabilizing when it comes with authority as alignment. Because authority is not alignment. Just because you have authority, quote unquote, doesn't actually make you aligned. True authority just comes from being aligned. So institutions sense a loss of narrative and control, and people who are stuck in institutions and in these ideologues or ideologies and demagogueries and all this stuff, they see this as a loss of narrative control. And if you remember narrative control, narrative is just a belief system. It's just what it is. It doesn't make it's not true. It doesn't make it true either, though. It's just something that could or could not exist in reality. It's a hypothetical for all intents and purposes. God, so what else does the Regal timeline theory debunk then? God as linear, reactive, offended, and punishes sin, and the second coming of Christ does not have to be in the future. Oh boy, yep, we're going there. Yep, we're going there. Rolling up the sleeves now, because I already can feel the people getting pissed off. But there's going to be a lot of people that are free from this, and that's what I want to focus on. I'm not trying to be inflammatory. I'm trying to really give insight to a structure of how to navigate reality. So dogma says that God gets angry, he changes his mind, he plays favorites like chosen ones, right? He punishes disbelief. That's what dogma says. What sin is not, well, it's not offending God. Sin is entering a collapsing timeline. You're only doing harm to yourself, ultimately. But, I mean, you can be doing harm to others when you sin, for sure. But ultimately, like, people, this goes back to the resurrection, right? This goes back to, I'm the resurrection and the life. Anybody who's not awake might as well be you in another timeline. I'm not saying it is. I'm not saying it's not. I'm saying that it might as well be you in another timeline. So the fact that yeah, like you are only doing harm to yourself, potentially. Okay, and again, it's a pattern of time. But sin nonetheless is a collapsing timeline. And hell then is a place on a timeline where no viable option to enter another timeline is available. Hell is a place on a timeline where no viable option to enter another timeline is available. It does not have to be a literal place. It does not have to be a literal place. And I know a lot of Christians are going to probably get upset about that, and a lot of Muslims are probably a lot of people are going to get upset about this. But I know a lot of people are going to be free from this. Again, people are going to be free from this. Okay, I've been to hell. I've been to a place on a timeline where there was no viable option to enter another timeline, and it was hell. It was absolutely hell. There was no way to escape the pain of that timeline until I just experienced it and I got out of it. That is hell. So then, what is the second coming of Christ? Well, universality in timeline is purely an event-based thing. It's an event that is event-based. So what's happened has happened, and what will happen will happen. Therefore, consciousness aligned with event time in their individuation constellation will experience the second coming of Christ as a real-time experience if the world has not perceived it in event time. Oh, let me say that again. Any consciousness aligned with event time, which is nonlinear, right? And we just talked about before how any event and any revelation is not linear. It can't be. By definition, it cannot be linear. So event in event times is with the coming of Christ. Therefore, any consciousness aligned with event time in their individuation constellation will experience the second coming of Christ as a real-time experience if the world has not perceived it in event time. In other words, if individual time merges with event time, the second coming of Christ is experientially real wherever alignment exists. Truth bomb. Truth bomb. What else does the Regal timeline theory debunk? Hard work guarantees success. No, it's not true. Timeline theory shows that effort alone does not create viable outcomes. Success is access to higher frequency, low entropy timelines, not hours worked. So just because you're working a lot of hours doesn't mean you're getting a lot of stuff done. However, it depends on how you view that. It depends on what you do within the hours that you work. Okay, because you might be able to work a lot of hours, and you could actually get to a good place, right? You can get to a good place working a lot of hours, but is it going to be viable? Is it producing viable outcomes, or is it not? Okay, the Regal timeline theory says that if you're operating in low entropy timelines, which is essentially a low value timeline where there's a lot of drag to increase the velocity or the momentum that you have, if there's a lot of drag, then you're not really operating on a good timeline, man. You're just not. So you can work tirelessly on collapsing timelines and produce nothing. There's not going to be any real fruit that comes from this. So here's a replacement option then. Think about strategic alignment, timing and network, and the coherence over brute effort. It's not to say that brute effort doesn't do well, because at the end of the day, yeah, if you want to be on a viable timeline, yeah, you want to have coherence. But if you just want to win, yeah, brute effort, that's going to win. No doubt. Brute effort can win, but it's not going to be long term. It's not going to be on a high value timeline. It's just not. What else is the Regal timeline theory debunk? Well, love as a form of self-sacrifice in romanticized form. Okay, think about how the Regal timeline theory shows that chronic self-sacrifice collapses any potential future timeline. One-sided adaptation only creates negative entropy in relationships. So if you're doing all the work and you're doing all the effort, and the other person is just, you're thinking you're doing it for a good cause, but the other person just doesn't even care. Well, then what you're doing is you're just giving your life force to a black hole. That's what you're doing. You're giving it to a vortex. It's like a narcissist, right? Not all people that are operating this way are narcissists, by the way. They have narcissistic traits, but they're not narcissists. We all have narcissistic traits, but some just have them more so than others. And then finally, martyrdom destabilizes connections, whether we want them to or not. If you become a martyr, it's not going to work. It's just not going to work in the Regal timeline theory. So then healthy relationships with the Regal timeline theory suggests that mutual timeline expansion is going to be paramount. Are you both on a timeline that expands rather than contracts? Not one person shrinking so the other can remain unchanged. The short-term sacrifice can be loving, of course, but long-term self-betrayal is a recipe for relationship decay. Because that's what martyrdom does. That's what one-sided adaptation does. Okay, long-term self-betrayal is a recipe for relationship decay. And that's going to conclude everything with the timeline theory today. And I hope that this was giving you a lot of insight and a lot of information about how to navigate through the terrain of time and how to discern time better and how to make better decisions faster. Because this all really boils down to how are you living and why are you living the way that you are? It's as simple as that. So with all that being said, I hope this message was useful and insightful for you. Stay blessed. Peace. Until next time.